April 7th, 1945. Tokyo Bay, Japan. 1,043 hours, 25,000 feet. Lieutenant Kazuki Hayashi pressed his right eye against the gun sight of his Mitsubishi Zero fighter. His left eye had been gone since 1943, taken by American bullets over the Solomon Islands. The empty socket didn't hurt anymore. What hurt was what he saw through the working eye. 96 silver aircraft circled above Tokyo at his altitude. Single-engine fighters, not the twin-tailed lightnings that occasionally made the impossible journey from distant carriers. These were different, sleeker, faster, and they were everywhere. Kazuki checked his fuel gauge. 47 minutes remaining. His ammunition counter showed 240 rounds of 20mm shells and 460 rounds of 13mm machine gun bullets. Enough to kill perhaps 3 enemy aircraft if his shooting was perfect. But there were 96 of them. The mathematics made no sense. Tokyo Bay sat 750 statute miles from Iwo Jima, the volcanic island American Marines had taken 5 weeks earlier. Kazuki had attended the briefing. Japanese intelligence officers had assured them that no single-engine American fighter possessed the range to fly from Iwo Jima to Tokyo. The distances were too great, the fuel requirements impossible, the ocean too vast. Yet there they were. The enemy fighters flew in perfect four-ship formations, stacked from 23,000 feet to 28,000 feet. Their polished aluminum surfaces gleamed in the morning sun. Each aircraft had a distinctive bubble canopy that gave the pilot unobstructed vision in all directions. 6 machine guns bristled from each wing. Sleek external fuel tanks hung beneath the wings of some, though many had already jettisoned theirs, and the tanks were tumbling toward the ocean below. Escorting the fighters were 103 Boeing B-29 Superfortresses, the massive 4-engine bombers that had been burning Japanese cities for months. Each B-29 measured 99 feet long with a 141-foot wingspan. Together this aerial armada could level entire city blocks, and now they had fighter protection all the way to Tokyo. Kazuki keyed his radio transmitter. "This cannot be happening," he muttered into his oxygen mask. His breath condensed in the frigid air at 25,000 feet. The temperature outside his cockpit was minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit. His wingman, Second Lieutenant Takeshi Yamada, responded immediately. The young pilot's voice carried an edge of panic that violated every principle of Japanese military discipline. "Hayashi-san, I count nearly 100 enemy fighters. Single engine, how did they—" "Silence on the radio," Kazuki snapped, but his own mind was asking the same question. How, below them, Tokyo sprawled across the landscape. Kazuki could see the Imperial Palace, the government buildings, the industrial districts that fed Japan's war machine. Somewhere down there in a small apartment in the Shinjuku district, his wife Yuki and 7-year-old daughter Emiko were probably listening to the air raid sirens. They would be heading to the shelters trusting that Japanese fighters would protect them. Kazuki had flown in combat since 1938. 7 years of war, China first, then the Philippines, then throughout the Pacific. He had shot down 64 enemy aircraft. American Wildcats, British Hurricanes, Dutch Brewster Buffaloes, Chinese D-16s. He knew how to fight. He knew how to kill. He had survived wounds that killed other men, including the bullet that took his eye. But he had never seen anything like this. The formation of American fighters maintained perfect spacing and altitude discipline. They flew with the confidence of men who knew they owned the sky. Their tactics showed months of training and combat experience. These were not green pilots making their first mission. These were veterans flying the most advanced fighter aircraft Kazuki had ever encountered. Japanese ground radar had detected the incoming raid at 10:15 hours. The initial reports seemed so impossible that radar operators checked their equipment 3 times. A massive formation of B-29 bombers approaching from the south, which had become routine. But accompanying the bombers were dozens of single-engine fighter aircraft. The radar supervisor had called higher headquarters to report a possible equipment malfunction. Single-engine fighters from where the nearest American aircraft carriers were hundreds of miles to the east. Iwo Jima was under American control, true, but even the Americans could not fly fighters 750 miles. The intelligence officer on duty had checked the mathematics on a chalkboard. Average fighter combat radius 200 to 300 miles. Distance from Iwo Jima to Tokyo 750 miles. Round trip 1,500 miles. Fuel consumption for typical fighter 70 to 80 gallons per hour. Internal fuel capacity 200 to 250 gallons maximum. Flight time available 3 to 4 hours. Flight time required 8 hours minimum. The numbers proved it impossible, yet the radar images were unmistakable. The report went up the chain of command, each level more skeptical than the last. Colonel Nakamura, commander of Tokyo Air Defense, read the report 3 times before issuing the scramble order. All available fighters, immediate takeoff. Unknown enemy fighter type approaching with bomber formation. Assume carrier-based Hellcats or Corsairs. Engage and destroy. Kazuki had received the order at his airfield 40 miles north of Tokyo. He had climbed into his Zero at 10:20 hours, gone through his pre-flight checks with the efficiency of 7 years' practice, and lifted off at 10:25 hours. The climb to 25,000 feet took 18 minutes. His squadron of 18 Zeros joined with formations of Kai-84, Franks, Kai-61 Tonys, and other fighter types until 150 Japanese fighters filled the sky over Tokyo, the largest air defense response of 1945. And now at 10:43 hours, Kazuki understood why. He studied the enemy fighters through his gun sight. They were definitely not Hellcats. The Grumman F-6 F Hellcat had a barrel-shaped fuselage and a distinctive profile. These aircraft were different. They were not Corsairs either. The Vought F-4U Corsair had inverted gull wings that made it impossible to mistake. These enemy fighters had straight wings with a laminar flow design that Kazuki had only seen in technical intelligence briefings. The canopy design was revolutionary. The bubble canopy provided vision that Japanese pilots could only dream of. Kazuki's Zero had a traditional framed canopy with metal supports that created blind spots. He had to physically turn his head and crane his neck to check his 6 o'clock position. The American pilots could simply glance back through their clear canopies, 6 machine guns per aircraft. Kazuki counted them carefully, 3 in each wing. That meant 1,800 to 2,000 rounds of ammunition per fighter. His Zero carried 250 rounds of 20mm cannon shells and 460 rounds of 13mm machine gun bullets. Total ammunition weight perhaps 430 pounds. The American fighters carried 850 pounds of ammunition or more, but the most disturbing feature was the speed. Kazuki watched one of the enemy fighters break from formation to investigate a lone Japanese Ki-43 Oscar that had climbed too aggressively. The American pilot rolled inverted, pulled through into a dive and accelerated after the Oscar. Within 5 seconds, the enemy fighter had closed from 1,000 yards to 400 yards. The American pilot fired a 2-second burst. The Oscar's wings separated from the fuselage. The Japanese pilot never had time to bail out. The American fighter then pulled up into a zoom climb, trading speed for altitude, and rejoined his formation at 25,000 feet. The entire engagement took 12 seconds. Kazuki's Zero could not have accelerated that quickly, even in a dive, even with full throttle. The speed differential was staggering. Colonel Nakamura's voice crackled over the radio. "All fighters, this is Dragon Leader. Enemy fighters have been identified as new American type, designation unknown. Exercise extreme caution. Use altitude advantage to dive and extend. Do not attempt turning engagements until we understand their performance." Too late for that, Kazuki thought. 3 Japanese fighters were already burning as they fell toward Tokyo below. He scanned the sky and counted the enemy aircraft again. 96 fighters, perhaps more he couldn't see. Against 150 Japanese fighters, the numbers seemed reasonable, but numbers meant nothing if the quality gap was too wide. Kazuki had learned that lesson in 1943. The memory came unbidden. Solomon Islands, August 1943. His squadron of Zeros had intercepted a formation of American bombers escorted by P-38 Lightnings. The Zeros had been confident. The Zero was the finest fighter in the Pacific. Japanese pilots were the best trained in the world. They would sweep the Americans from the sky. Then the P-38s had demonstrated their twin-engine power and their ability to dive away from any engagement. Kazuki's squadron had shot down 2 P-38s, but lost 11 Zeros. He had taken a .50 caliber bullet through his canopy that shattered the metal frame, drove fragments into his right eye, and continued through the headrest behind him. The pain had been indescribable. Blood filled his oxygen mask. He could not see, could not breathe, could not think. Somehow he had landed the Zero at his base. The medical officer said he would never fly again. Kazuki had proven him wrong through sheer determination and 6 months of practice learning to fly with one eye. But the lesson remained. American aircraft were getting better. Japanese aircraft were not. Now in April 1945, that gap had become a chasm. Kazuki checked his fuel gauge again. 43 minutes remaining. He had been airborne for 23 minutes. Combat would burn fuel faster than cruising flight. He had perhaps 30 minutes of fighting time before he would need to break off and return to base. The American fighters had apparently flown for 3 hours to reach Tokyo. They had fuel for combat. They had fuel for the 3-hour return flight. They had margin for emergency. The fuel capacity required for such a mission defied everything Kazuki knew about fighter aircraft design. His Zero carried 139 gallons of fuel in wing tanks and 34 gallons in a fuselage tank, total 173 gallons. At cruise power, his Nakajima Sakai engine consumed approximately 35 gallons per hour, maximum endurance 5 hours, maximum range perhaps 100 miles if he flew perfectly and landed with dry tanks. But the Americans had flown 750 miles, would fight for 30 to 90 minutes and would fly 750 miles back. That required 1,500 miles of range plus combat reserve, at least 1,700 miles total capability. Impossible, unless... Kazuki looked again at the external fuel tanks he had seen earlier. Drop tanks, the Americans called them drop tanks, expendable fuel containers that could be jettisoned before combat. Japanese aircraft had drop tanks too, but they were crude, poorly manufactured, and in desperately short supply. American drop tanks appeared to be precision-built aluminum containers that could carry hundreds of gallons of additional fuel. The mathematics suddenly made terrible sense. Internal fuel perhaps 250 gallons, external fuel perhaps 200 to 300 gallons more. Total capacity 500 to 550 gallons. At economical cruise settings, consuming 60 to 70 gallons per hour, endurance would be 7 to 9 hours, more than enough for the mission. American industrial capacity had solved the impossible equation. Kazuki felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature at altitude. If the Americans could fly fighters 750 miles to Tokyo, then there was no safe airspace left over Japan. Every city, every airfield, every factory was now within range of American fighter attack. The defensive perimeter that Japanese military planners had assured their forces would protect the homeland had just been shattered. His daughter's face flashed in his mind. Emiko's 7 years old with her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn determination. Last night, she had asked him if the Americans would ever reach Tokyo. No, sweetheart. He had lied. They can't reach us. We're safe. The lie burned now worse than the wound that had taken his eye. The voice of Colonel Nakamura broke through Kazuki's thoughts. All Dragon flights, we are cleared to engage. Fighter division will attack from altitude. Bomber division will target the B-29s. Execute on my mark. 3, 2, 1. Mark. Kazuki pushed his stick forward and dropped the nose of his Zero. Altitude advantage was everything in aerial combat. Height equaled speed in a dive. Speed equaled energy. Energy equaled life. He selected a target. One of the silver fighters flying slightly separated from its formation. The American pilot appeared to be checking something in his cockpit, not paying attention. A moment of vulnerability. Kazuki aligned his gun sight, adjusted for deflection, and waited for the range to close. 800 yards, 700, 600. The enemy aircraft grew larger in his sight. Still, the pilot hadn't noticed the threat diving from above. 500 yards. Kazuki's finger tightened on the cannon trigger. His Zero carried two 20mm Type 99 cannons that fired through the propeller arc, powerful weapons that could destroy an enemy aircraft with a single, well-placed hit. But the slow rate of fire, only 500 rounds per minute, meant that every shot had to count. 400 yards. Optimal range. Kazuki pressed the trigger. The cannon roared. The Zero shuddered as both guns fired 8 rounds in a 2-second burst. Bright orange tracers arced through the sky toward the target, and missed. The American pilot had seen him at the last instant. A slight turn to the left, a gentle push forward on the stick. The enemy fighter dropped 20 feet and accelerated. The 20mm shells passed through empty air where the target had been 1 second earlier. Kazuki fired again. Another 8-round burst, his remaining ammunition 234 rounds of 20mm shells. The American aircraft rolled right and accelerated harder. Kazuki pushed his throttle to the stops. His Nakajima Sakai engine was already at maximum power. The Zero should have been accelerating, closing the distance, bringing his guns to bear. Instead, the gap widened. The enemy fighter pulled away as if Kazuki's Zero was standing still. Kazuki's airspeed indicator showed 380 miles per hour in the dive, the fastest his Zero could fly. The enemy aircraft was pulling away from him at 380 miles per hour, which meant the American fighter was flying faster than 400 miles per hour, perhaps 420, perhaps more. The speed differential was not 20 or 30 miles per hour, it was 40 to 50 miles per hour. In aerial combat, that gap was the difference between life and death. The faster aircraft could engage or disengage at will. The slower aircraft was trapped, forced to accept combat on the enemy's terms, or run and hope for clouds or friendly cover. Kazuki had no clouds, no friendly cover that could help, just empty sky and an enemy he could not catch. He pulled back on the stick and climbed back toward 23,000 feet. His fuel gauge showed 38 minutes remaining. He had burned 5 minutes of fuel on one unsuccessful attack. The reality of the situation crystallized with brutal clarity. Japan's fighter defense was obsolete. Not inferior, not disadvantaged, obsolete. The enemy fighters were so much faster that Japanese pilots could not force an engagement unless the Americans chose to fight. And if the Americans chose to fight, they could attack with impunity, from above dive through Japanese formations at speeds Japanese fighters could not match and extend away before any countermeasures could be taken. The Mitsubishi Zero had ruled the Pacific skies in 1941 and 1942. Kazuki had flown that domination, killing Chinese and American and British pilots who simply could not match the Zero's maneuverability and range. But the Zero was a 1940 design. It was now 1945. 5 years in wartime aircraft development might as well be 50 years in peacetime. And the Americans had spent those 5 years building better fighters. Across the sky over Tokyo, the same scene repeated itself dozens of times. Japanese pilots dove on American fighters. American pilots saw the attacks, made slight adjustments, and accelerated away. A few Japanese pilots got lucky and scored hits. Most fired and missed and watched in frustration as their targets escaped. The American fighters did not dogfight. They did not turn with the Zeros and try to outturn them. They used speed and power to dictate every engagement. They dove from altitude, fired precise bursts from their 6 machine guns, and climbed back to altitude before the Japanese fighters could respond. Captain James Barrett of the 78th Fighter Squadron executed the tactic to perfection. He was flying a North American P-51D Mustang tail number 44-1415, one-armed with 6 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns and 1,880 rounds of ammunition. His Packard Merlin IV 16507 engine produced 1,695 horsepower at war emergency power. His aircraft weighed 11,600 pounds fully loaded and could reach 437 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. Barrett spotted 3 Zeros flying in a loose V formation at 15,000 feet, 8,000 feet below his position. He rolled inverted, pulled through into a steep dive and let gravity and power accelerate his Mustang to 450 miles per hour. The Zero pilots saw him coming. They turned hard left, trying to force a turning fight where their superior maneuverability would give them advantage. Barrett ignored the turn. He adjusted his dive angle slightly, aligned his gun sight on the trailing Zero, and opened fire at 400 yards. His 6.50 caliber machine guns fired at a combined rate of 5,000 rounds per minute. A 2-second burst put 160 rounds into the air. 23 of those rounds hit the Zero's left wing and engine. The wing structure failed. The engine exploded. The Zero disintegrated. Barrett did not watch it fall. He was already pulling back on his stick, using his speed to climb back to 22,000 feet. His Mustang climbed at 3,400 feet per minute. The surviving Zeros could climb at 2,900 feet per minute. They could not follow. Barrett rolled level at 22,000 feet, checked his fuel, still had 310 gallons remaining, plenty for combat, and the flight home, and scanned for more targets. The 2 surviving Zeros were still at 15,000 feet, circling warily, not daring to climb into the Mustangs above them. Barrett smiled behind his oxygen mask. This was the tactical advantage Major Daniel Cross had drilled into them during training. Never turn with a zero, never slow down, use speed and power to control the engagement. Attack from above, fire and extend, climb and reposition. Attack again. The Zeros had no answer for it. At 11:15 hours, 15 minutes after the first contact, the air battle over Tokyo was producing results that would shock Japanese military leadership. American fighter pilots had claimed 21 Japanese aircraft destroyed, 1 probable, and 5 damaged. Japanese anti-aircraft fire and desperate fighter attacks had managed to shoot down 2 P-51 Mustangs. 1 additional American pilot had to bail out when his aircraft suffered catastrophic mechanical failure over Tokyo Bay. He would be captured and spend the last 4 months of the war as a prisoner. The exchange ratio was devastating. More than 10 Japanese aircraft lost for every American fighter shot down. But the statistics that truly mattered were about the bombers. Only 3 B-29 superfortresses had been lost to enemy action. For an unescorted raid, typical losses ran 8 to 12 bombers. The fighter escort had cut losses by 2/3. The 103 B-29s dropped 613 tons of incendiary bombs on Tokyo's industrial districts. Fires burned across 15 square miles of the city. The bombing accuracy was significantly better than previous high-altitude raids because the bombers could fly lower with fighter protection. And through it all, 94 P-51 Mustangs maintained station, protecting their charges, destroying any Japanese fighter that dared approach. Kazuki watched the bombs fall on his city. He had 31 minutes of fuel remaining. Ammunition, 218 rounds of 20mm shells, 420 rounds of 13mm bullets. He had fired at 4 different enemy aircraft. He had scored no hits. He had not even forced a single enemy fighter to break formation. Around him, the remnants of the Japanese fighter force circled helplessly. They were outnumbered, outperformed, and burning through their limited fuel supplies while the enemy operated with apparent impunity. The radio chatter told the story. "I hit him twice and he kept flying. How are they absorbing that much damage? I can't catch them. Full throttle and they're pulling away. Dragon 3 is down. Dragon 5 is down. Dragon 11 is burning." Colonel Nakamura's voice cut through the chaos. "All Dragon flights disengage. Return to base. We cannot sustain these losses." The order to retreat. Unprecedented in Kazuki's experience. Japanese fighters did not retreat. They fought until victory or death. But Nakamura was right. To continue fighting would accomplish nothing except the destruction of Japan's already depleted fighter force. Kazuki turned south toward his airfield. His wingman, Lieutenant Yamada, formed up on his right wing. Yamada was 22 years old. He had been flying for 6 months. This was his 3rd combat mission. The young pilot's hands were shaking on his control stick. Kazuki could see the tremors even from 50 feet away. "Steady, Yamada," Kazuki transmitted. "You survived. That is enough for today." "Hayashi-san!" Yamada's voice broke. "How do we fight them? They're too fast, too well-armed, too many." Kazuki had no answer. The question was valid and terrible and unanswerable. He flew south in silence, watching his fuel gauge count down. 26 minutes? 23? 19? The Nakajima engine ran smoothly, the familiar vibration transmitted through the airframe into his body. He had flown this aircraft for 8 months. He knew every quirk and characteristic. The slight pull to the left that required constant right rudder pressure. The rough idle that smoothed out above 1,500 RPM. The way the guns jammed if he fired too many rounds too quickly. A fine aircraft, a beautiful aircraft. An aircraft that represented the peak of Japanese fighter design in 1940. But it was now April 1945, and the Americans had brought the future to Tokyo's skies. Kazuki landed with 14 minutes of fuel remaining. He taxied to his revetment, shut down the engine, and sat in the cockpit for 2 full minutes without moving. His hands were steady. His breathing was controlled. His mind was calm. 7 years of combat had trained him to manage fear and stress. But his heart was sick. He climbed out of the Zero and walked to the operations tent where intelligence officers would debrief him. Other pilots were already there, faces pale, voices strained. They had all seen the same thing. They had all reached the same conclusion. The intelligence officer spread maps across a makeshift table and pointed to Iwo Jima. Confirmed. The American fighters flew from Iwo Jima Single engine type identified from gun camera footage as the P-51 Mustang, powered by Packard Merlin engine estimated 1,700 horsepower, top speed estimated at 430 to 440 miles per hour, range sufficient to fly from Iwo Jima to Tokyo and return with combat reserve. The room fell silent. One of the senior pilots spoke. His voice was flat, emotionless, defeated. Then Tokyo is no longer safe. If they can escort bombers here, they will come every day. We cannot stop them. We do not have the fuel, the pilots, or the aircraft to contest American air superiority over our own capital. The intelligence officer nodded slowly. Recommendations have been forwarded to High Command, but yes, that assessment is accurate. Kazuki left the debriefing and walked to his quarters. He shared a small room with 3 other pilots. 2 of them had not returned from today's mission. Their beds were empty. Their personal effects would be packed up and sent to their families within the week. He sat on his bed and pulled out a small notebook that he kept hidden beneath his mattress. The notebook was forbidden. Pilots were not supposed to keep personal journals. The risk of capture and intelligence compromise was too great. But Kazuki had kept this journal since 1941, and he would not stop now. He opened to a blank page and began to write. April 7th, 1945. Tokyo. Today I saw the future, and it belongs to America. Their new fighter, the Mustang, is superior to our Zero in every measurable way except low-speed maneuverability. And their tactics prevent us from exploiting that single advantage. They are faster, they have more powerful engines, superior firepower, better radios, and most critically, they have unlimited range with their drop tank system. We are defending our homeland with aircraft designed 5 years ago. They are attacking us with the most advanced fighter in the world. Unless something changes dramatically, we cannot win this air war. The Americans flew 750 miles to reach Tokyo. They fought over our capital. They will fly 750 miles back to their base. Total 1,500 miles. Our intelligence said it was impossible. Our mathematicians proved it was impossible. But mathematics means nothing when your enemy has better engineers. He closed the notebook and slid it back under his mattress. Then he lay back on his bed and stared at the ceiling. Outside he could hear the sounds of ground crews working on aircraft, mechanics shouting instructions, metal tools clanging, engines being tested, the normal sounds of an active fighter base. But nothing was normal anymore. The Americans had done the impossible. They had solved the fuel equation. They had designed the perfect long-range fighter. They had established air superiority over Japan itself. And Kazuki knew with the certainty of 7 years combat experience that this was just the beginning. The flight back to Iwo Jima tested the American pilots as much as the combat had. Captain Robert Mitchell, callsign Ghost, watched his fuel gauge with obsessive attention. He was flying P-51 detail number 44-13579. His Packard Merlin engine had run flawlessly for 7 hours. But the hairline crack in his auxiliary fuel tank had been weeping fuel since hour 2. The maintenance chief had found the crack during the final pre-flight inspection. The chief had looked at Mitchell and said, "We can patch it, but it's going to seep, maybe 3 to 5 gallons per hour, maybe more if the vibration widens the crack." Mitchell had made a decision. Patch it. I'm not missing this mission. Major Daniel Cross had been standing nearby. He had heard the exchange. He had said nothing. But his eyes had met Mitchell's, and the message was clear. Your choice. Your risk. Your responsibility. Now at hour 7 of the mission, Mitchell's choice was coming due. His fuel gauge showed 18 gallons remaining. The distance to Iwo Jima, 15 nautical miles. At his current airspeed of 250 miles per hour, he needed 3.6 minutes of flying time to reach the island. His engine was consuming fuel at a rate of 70 gallons per hour normally, but the leak was now pouring fuel at approximately 12 gallons per hour. Combined consumption, 82 gallons per hour or 1.37 gallons per minute. 18 gallons divided by 1.37 gallons per minute equaled 13 minutes of fuel remaining. 13 minutes of fuel, 3.6 minutes of flying time needed, margin 9.4 minutes, but those numbers assumed everything went perfectly. No headwinds, no need to maneuver, no engine problems, no diverted landing pattern if another aircraft was on the runway when he arrived. Mitchell did the next calculation. If his engine quit right now, could he glide to Iwo Jima current altitude 8,000 feet? The P-51D had a glide ratio of approximately 10 to 1. For every foot of altitude, he could glide 10 feet horizontally. 8,000 feet of altitude could be converted into 80,000 feet of horizontal distance. 80,000 feet divided by 5,280 feet per mile equaled 15.15 miles. Current distance to runway 15 miles. The math was merciless and precise. He could glide to the runway if his engine quit right now, but not if it quit in 5 minutes or 10 minutes. The margin was vanishing. Mitchell checked his airspeed, 180 miles per hour, the optimal glide speed. His altitude descending through 7,800 feet. The volcanic black ash of Iwo Jima was visible ahead, growing larger. 12 miles to go. Fuel gauge 16 gallons, 10 miles to go. Fuel gauge 14 gallons, 8 miles to go. Fuel gauge 11 gallons. His engine coughed, just once. A momentary hesitation in the smooth roar of the Packard Merlin. Then it smoothed out and continued running. Mitchell's hands tightened on the control stick. His fuel gauge showed 8 gallons. The needle was bouncing now, indicating fuel starvation. The engine would quit within minutes. Distance to runway 7.2 miles. His engine coughed again. This time it didn't smooth out. The coughing became a sputter. The propeller began to windmill as the engine lost power. And then silence. The Packard Merlin, the 5-16507, which had run perfectly for 7 hours and 17 minutes, quit. Out of fuel, dead stick. Mitchell's hands moved through the emergency procedures with practiced precision. Airspeed maintain 180 miles per hour. Trim, adjust for best glide. Propeller full forward to reduce drag. Mixture, idle cutoff. Magnetos off. Fuel selector off. The only sound was the wind whistling past his canopy and the propeller windmilling uselessly. Distance to runway 7.2 miles. Altitude 8,000 feet. Glide ratio 10 to 1. Maximum glide distance 15.15 miles. The mathematics said he would make it, just barely, with zero margin for error. Mitchell established his glide, trimmed the aircraft perfectly, and began a shallow descent toward Iwo Jima. The black volcanic island grew larger. He could see the runways now, could see other P-51s in the landing pattern, could see the crash trucks and emergency vehicles that always stood by during flight operations. Altitude 6,000 feet, distance 4 miles. Glide ratio still good, still on profile. Altitude 4,000 feet, distance 2 miles. He would make it to the field. The question was whether he would make it to the runway or land short in the volcanic ash and wreck the aircraft. Altitude 2,000 feet, distance 1 mile. Mitchell lined up with the runway. No power, no engine, just altitude and airspeed and the aerodynamic perfection of the P-51's laminar flow wing. Altitude 500 feet, distance 1/4 mile. The runway threshold passed beneath him. He was going to make it. Mitchell held his glide speed until the last possible moment, then pulled back gently on the stick to flare. The Mustang settled onto the runway in a perfect 3-point landing. The tail wheel touched first, then the main gear. He rolled for 2,000 feet before friction brought the aircraft to a stop. 0 fuel remaining, 0 altitude to spare, 0 margin of error. He sat in the cockpit for 10 seconds, hands trembling now that the crisis was over. Then he popped the canopy open and climbed out onto the wing. Major Cross was already running toward the aircraft. Behind him, ground crew members were sprinting across the volcanic ash. Cross stopped 20 feet from the P-51 and looked at Mitchell. Then he looked at the fuel gauge visible through the open canopy. Then he looked back at Mitchell. "You had a crack in your tank and didn't report it." Mitchell nodded. "Yes, sir." "Why?" "Didn't want to miss history, sir." Cross was silent for 5 seconds. When he spoke, his voice was level but hard. "You made it. That's what counts. But never again, Ghost. You pull something like that again, and I will ground you permanently. Understood?" "Yes, sir." Cross turned and walked back toward the operations tent. Mitchell watched him go, then looked at his P-51. The aircraft that had carried him 1,500 miles on fuel that should have run out 50 miles ago. American engineering, American manufacturing, American quality control. The aircraft had performed flawlessly, even with a damaged fuel tank. The engine had run perfectly until the last drop of fuel was consumed. The glide performance had been exactly what the manual predicted. Mitchell realized something in that moment. The P-51 Mustang was not just a good fighter. It was the finest integration of engine, airframe, and systems that any nation had ever produced. It was what happened when unlimited industrial capacity focused on a single goal: build the best, and they had succeeded. He climbed down from the wing and walked toward the debriefing tent. Behind him, ground crew members were already examining his aircraft, documenting the fuel tank crack, preparing the maintenance report. Ahead of him, the rest of the squadron was gathering to share stories of the mission. The impossible mission. The 750-mile mission that Japanese intelligence had declared impossible. They had flown to Tokyo. They had fought over the Japanese capital. They had escorted the bombers and protected them from the desperate attacks of outclassed Japanese fighters. And they had flown home. 96 P-51 Mustangs had launched from Iwo Jima that morning. 93 had returned. One was a dead stick landing with zero fuel. But 93 had returned. The mathematics of impossibility had been rewritten by American engineers who refused to accept limitations. And every Japanese pilot who had witnessed those silver fighters circling over Tokyo now understood a fundamental truth: Japan's defensive strategy was broken. The home islands were no longer safe. American air superiority was absolute. The war was not over, but its outcome was no longer in doubt. The debriefing room at Iwo Jima's South Field smelled of volcanic sulfur sweat and engine oil. 93 pilots crowded into a tent designed for 50. Some sat on folding chairs. Others stood against the canvas walls. A few sat on the dirt floor, too exhausted to care about comfort. Major Daniel Cross stood at the front beside a large map of Japan. Red marks indicated the route flown. Blue marks showed the combat area over Tokyo Bay. Black marks represented aircraft losses. Gentlemen, Cross began, today you accomplished something that will be studied in military academies for the next 100 years. You flew single-engine fighters 750 miles over open ocean. You engaged and defeated a numerically superior enemy force. You protected 103 heavy bombers with a loss rate of less than 3%. And you returned home. He paused and looked at Captain Robert Mitchell, who stood near the back of the tent. Most of you returned home with fuel to spare. Some of you cut it closer than I would prefer. A few pilots chuckled. Mitchell's dead stick landing had already become legendary. The ground crew had measured the fuel remaining in his tanks: 0 gallons in the mains, 0 in the auxiliary, and approximately 1 cup of fuel in the fuel lines, perhaps enough to run the engine for another 15 seconds. Cross continued. Intelligence preliminary assessment: 21 confirmed kills, 1 probable, 5 damaged. Our losses: 2 aircraft shot down, 1 mechanical failure resulting in bailout over Tokyo Bay. Pilot captured. Exchange ratio 10-1 in our favor. He let that sink in for a moment. But the real victory is strategic. We have proven that fighter escort to the Japanese home islands is not only possible, but sustainable. Every B-29 mission from this point forward will have P-51 escort. Japanese air defenses are now functionally irrelevant. Captain James Barrett, callsign Hawk, raised his hand. So what about the Japanese fighters? They seemed almost reluctant to engage toward the end. Cross nodded. Good observation, Hawk. Intelligence believes we shattered their tactical doctrine. The Zero has dominated through superior maneuverability since 1941. Japanese pilots are trained to force turning engagements where the Zero's advantage is decisive. But you didn't turn with them. You refused to fight their fight. Instead, you used speed and energy tactics they have no counter for. He pointed to the map. The Japanese pilot who survives today's mission will report to his superiors that American fighters can reach Tokyo, can fight over Tokyo, and cannot be defeated using current Japanese tactics. That psychological impact is worth more than the 21 aircraft we destroyed. Another pilot spoke up. Lieutenant Marcus Webb, 24 years old, with 4 missions under his belt. Sir, how long can we sustain these operations? 8 hours in the cockpit is brutal. And the fuel margins are razor thin. Cross looked at him steadily. The missions will continue 3 to 4 times per week, weather permitting. You will become accustomed to the 8-hour flights. As for fuel margins, that is why we have emergency procedures and rescue assets. Speaking of which, he gestured to an officer standing near the door. Commander Phillips from Navy Rescue Coordination has information on our lifeguard submarines. Commander Phillips stepped forward, a weather-beaten man in his 40s who had clearly spent years at sea. Gentlemen, starting with your next mission, we will have 3 fleet submarines positioned along your route at 250-mile intervals. If you go down in the water, your survival odds are approximately 60%, which are the best odds we can offer for Pacific operations. Each submarine will remain on station for 12 hours during your mission window. They have specific search areas and will surface when they detect distress signals. And he pointed to locations on the map. Here, here, and here. Memorize these positions. If you're going down, try to make it to a lifeguard station. Every mile closer to a submarine increases your survival probability by 5%. Webb pressed the point. 60% odds, sir. That means 4 in 10 don't make it. Correct, Phillips said without hesitation. The Pacific Ocean is 64 million square miles. We're doing our best, but we can't cover it all. Don't go in the water if you can possibly avoid it. The room fell silent. Every pilot understood the stakes. An 8-hour mission over hostile ocean with fuel margins measured in minutes. Engine failure meant death. Navigation error meant death. Combat damage meant death. Weather meant death. And they would do it 3 to 4 times per week. April 12, 1945. 5 days after the first Tokyo mission. The second long-range escort mission launched at 07:45 hours. Lieutenant Marcus Webb was flying P-51 tail number 4-14890. His fuel tanks were full, 269 gallons internal, plus 220 gallons in external drop tanks. Total 489 gallons. Consumption rate 70 gallons per hour. Endurance 6.99 hours. Mission time 8 hours. The mathematics bothered Webb more than he wanted to admit. Less than 7 hours of fuel for an 8-hour mission. The only way it worked was to fly at optimal cruise settings, 2,400 RPM, 28 inches of manifold pressure, and never deviate. No aggressive maneuvering, no combat power unless absolutely necessary. Smooth, efficient, perfect flying for 8 hours straight. Webb was not a perfect pilot. He knew it. Major Cross knew it. Everyone knew it. At hour 2, crossing the empty Pacific at 10,000 feet, Webb's engine began running rough, a slight miss, a momentary hesitation every 30 seconds or so. His fuel gauge showed 349 gallons remaining. Consumption rate right on target. But the engine roughness was new and concerning. Webb checked his instruments. Oil pressure normal, oil temperature normal, cylinder head temperature normal, manifold pressure steady, RPM steady. Everything appeared normal except for that periodic hesitation. He was experiencing the phenomenon that Major Cross had warned them about. Enhanced hearing. The psychological tendency to imagine engine problems where none existed. After 8 hours in a cramped cockpit, listening to the same engine note, the mind started creating problems. Small variations in sound became magnified into catastrophic failures. Webb forced himself to relax. His engine was fine. The gauges proved it. The roughness was in his imagination. Then his engine coughed. Not imagined. Real. A definite interruption in the smooth roar of the Packard Merlin. Webb's heart rate spiked. He checked the fuel selector on. Mixture auto rich. Propeller 2,400 RPM. Magnetos both on. Primer locked. Everything correct. His engine smoothed out and continued running normally. Webb keyed his radio. Dragon Leader, this is Dragon 7. Experiencing slight engine roughness. All gauges normal. Request permission to cycle magnetos. Major Cross responded immediately. Dragon 7 approved. Report results. Webb switched his magneto selector from both to left. The engine continued running smoothly on the left magneto alone. He switched to right. The engine ran smoothly on the right magneto alone. He switched back to both. The engine coughed again. Webb's training told him what was happening. One of his spark plugs was fouling. When both magnetos were firing, the fouled plug was creating a momentary misfire. But each magneto alone could maintain combustion without the fouled plug contributing. It was a minor problem, not critical. The engine would continue running, but it was also a warning. Spark plugs fouled when combustion was not optimal. Poor fuel mixture, carbon buildup, oil consumption, any of a dozen small issues that could cascade into larger problems. Webb made a decision. He leaned his mixture, slightly reducing fuel flow by 5%. The engine smoothed out immediately. The fouled plug was getting cleaner fuel mixture. The problem resolved, but now his fuel consumption was optimized past the margin of safety. He was running leaner than the mission profile called for. If he needed combat power later, the lean mixture could cause detonation and catastrophic engine failure. Webb said nothing on the radio. He had resolved the problem. No need to worry Cross or the squadron. He would monitor his engine carefully and adjust as needed. At hour 2.5, the formation spotted the Japanese coastline. Mount Fuji rose in the distance, snow-covered peak, brilliant against the blue sky. Webb had never seen anything so beautiful and so hostile at the same time. Major Cross transmitted, "All flights prepare to jettison drop tanks on my mark. 3, 2, 1, mark." Webb pulled the drop tank release handle. 220 pounds of external fuel fell away from each wing. The Mustang immediately felt lighter, more responsive. The drag reduction was noticeable. His airspeed increased from 250 miles per hour to 265 miles per hour at the same power setting, but now he was flying on internal fuel only, 269 gallons minus the 170 gallons consumed in the first 2.5 hours, remaining 99 gallons, flight time to Tokyo combat and return to Iwo Jima, 5.5 hours. Fuel needed 385 gallons at normal consumption, but less, with the reduced drag from jettisoned tanks. Webb did the mathematics in his head. He needed 62 gallons per hour for the remaining 5.5 hours. That required 341 gallons. He had 99 gallons plus whatever fuel efficiency he gained from the clean configuration. The numbers did not work. Unless the drag reduction saved him more than 15% fuel consumption, he would run out of fuel 30 miles short of Iwo Jima. Webb's hands started shaking on the control stick. He forced them steady. He had made his choice when he leaned the mixture. Now he would live with the consequences. The formation linked up with the B-29 bombers 20 miles south of Tokyo, 107 heavy bombers stacked from 15,000 to 22,000 feet. The P-51’s took up escort positions in a combat spread flights of 4, covering different altitude bands and sectors. Webb was flying in the high cover section at 26,000 feet. His job was to intercept any Japanese fighters attempting to dive on the bombers from above. At 11:25 hours, Japanese fighters appeared. Webb counted them quickly. Approximately 60 aircraft. Zeros mostly, but also some inline engine fighters he did not recognize. They were climbing from the west, trying to gain altitude advantage. Major Cross's voice crackled over the radio. "All Dragon flights, bandits, 11 o'clock high climbing. Estimate 60 plus. High cover engage and break up their formation. Middle cover maintain position on bombers. Low cover watch for leakers coming up from below." Webb pushed his throttle forward to combat power. His Packard Merlin responded instantly, power surging from 1,695 horsepower to 1,850 horsepower at war emergency settings. His airspeed increased rapidly, 280 miles per hour, 320, 360, 400. His fuel consumption increased proportionally. At combat power, his engine was burning 120 gallons per hour. He had perhaps 20 minutes of combat power available before his fuel situation became critical. The Japanese fighters continued climbing. They were at 23,000 feet now. Webb was at 26,000 feet with his flight of 4 Mustangs. The altitude advantage belonged to the Americans. Webb's flight leader, Captain Thomas Grant, transmitted, "Dragon 8 flight, we're going in. Standard boom and zoom. 1 pass, extend, climb, repeat. Do not turn with them." The 4 Mustangs rolled inverted and pulled through into steep dives. Webb's airspeed built rapidly, 420 miles per hour, 440, 460. He selected a zero that was flying slightly ahead of the main formation. The Japanese pilot probably thought his position was safe. He was wrong. Webb aligned his gun sight, adjusted for deflection, and waited for the range to close. His 6.50 caliber machine guns were charged and ready. Each gun held between 270 and 400 rounds depending on position. Total ammunition 1,880 rounds. Rate of fire 800 rounds per minute per gun. Combined rate 4,800 rounds per minute. At 600 yards, Webb pressed the trigger. The Mustang shuddered as all 6 guns fired simultaneously. The sound was like tearing canvas, magnified 1,000 times. Bright tracers arced toward the target and missed. Webb had misjudged the deflection angle. His rounds passed behind the Zero's tail. The Japanese pilot saw the tracers and reacted instantly. He snap-rolled left and pulled hard, entering a tight, descending turn. The Zero's legendary maneuverability was on full display. The turn radius was impossibly tight. Webb's training took over. Do not follow, do not turn with a Zero. Use speed to extend. He pushed his stick forward, maintaining his dive, accelerating past 480 miles per hour. The Zero disappeared behind him, unable to follow at that speed. Webb pulled back on the stick and began a zoom climb, trading speed for altitude. His Mustang climbed like a rocket, 3,000 feet per minute, 4,000. The altimeter unwound rapidly. 24,000 feet, 25,000, 26,000, 27,000. The Zero that had tried to engage him was still at 23,000 feet, climbing desperately, but unable to match the Mustang's climb rate. Webb rolled level at 27,000 feet and looked for his flight. Captain Grant had destroyed one Zero and was climbing back to altitude. The other two pilots were engaging separate targets. Webb's fuel gauge showed 61 gallons remaining. He had been at combat power for 6 minutes. His lean mixture setting was helping, but not enough. He was burning fuel faster than planned. Time in combat 6 minutes, fuel consumed 18 gallons. Fuel remaining 61 gallons. Distance to Iwo Jima 780 miles. Flight time approximately 3 hours. Fuel needed 180 gallons at cruise power. Webb had 61 gallons. He needed 180 gallons. The deficit was catastrophic. He keyed his radio. "Dragon Leader, this is Dragon 7. Fuel state critical. Request permission to depart early." Major Cross responded. "Dragon 7 approved. Make best speed to Iwo Jima. Report position every 30 minutes. Lifeguard submarines are monitoring this frequency." Webb acknowledged and turned south. Behind him, the air battle over Tokyo continued. He had fired one burst, scored no hits, and used 18 gallons of irreplaceable fuel. Now came the mathematics of survival. Webb climbed to 28,000 feet for maximum fuel efficiency. At that altitude, the air was thin enough to reduce drag significantly. His Packard Merlin engine, equipped with a 2-stage supercharger, could maintain cruise power at altitude where Japanese fighters would struggle. He set his power to absolute minimum cruise, 2,000 RPM, 22 inches of manifold pressure. Mixture leaned aggressively to the ragged edge of acceptable combustion. His airspeed settled at 210 miles per hour. Fuel consumption at these settings 52 gallons per hour. Better than the planned 62 gallons per hour, but still not enough. Webb did the mathematics again. Fuel remaining 61 gallons. Consumption rate 52 gallons per hour. Endurance 1.17 hours or 70 minutes. Distance at 210 miles per hour in 70 minutes, 245 miles. He was 780 miles from Iwo Jima. He could fly 245 miles before his engine quit. The gap was 535 miles. He would go down in the Pacific 535 miles north of Iwo Jima. The first lifeguard submarine was positioned 250 miles south of Tokyo. Webb would make it past that submarine before his fuel ran out. The second submarine was positioned 500 miles south of Tokyo. He would not make it to that submarine. He would ditch in the ocean somewhere between the two lifeguard stations, 250 miles from the nearest rescue asset, in an ocean where the water temperature was 62 degrees Fahrenheit. Survival time before hypothermia, 3 to 4 hours in a life vest. Maybe 6 hours if he was lucky. Webb's hands were shaking again. This time he could not steady them. He had made a mistake. A small mistake, leaning the mixture to fix a fouled spark plug. That decision had saved him from an engine failure in the first hour, but it had also put him in a fuel deficit that he could not recover from. The mathematics were merciless. Every decision had consequences that rippled forward through the mission. Lean the mixture too much and you burn less fuel but risk engine damage. Leave the mixture rich and you burn more fuel but maintain engine safety margins. There was no perfect answer, just trade-offs and compromises and hope that your calculations were correct. Webb had calculated incorrectly. Now he would pay the price. At hour 4 of his flight, Webb's fuel gauge showed 38 gallons remaining. He had passed the first lifeguard submarine position 30 minutes earlier. He was now 450 miles from Iwo Jima and running out of options. He transmitted his position. "Any lifeguard station, this is Dragon 7. Position 170 miles north of Lifeguard Station 2. Fuel critical. Estimate engine failure in 45 minutes. Request homing guidance." A new voice came over the radio, calm, professional, with the distinctive drawl of a southern accent. "Dragon 7, this is Lifeguard 2. We copy your position. We are submerging and proceeding north at flank speed. Estimate we can close to within 90 miles of your projected ditching position. Surface rescue assets are being scrambled from Iwo Jima. They will reach you approximately 3 hours after ditching. You need to survive in the water for 3 hours. Acknowledge." Webb's voice was steady, despite the fear. Lifeguard 2 Dragon 7 acknowledges. Will survive 3 hours. Over. Good man, Dragon 7. We're coming for you. Lifeguard 2 out. Webb checked his equipment. May West life preserver secure. Parachute still attached, but would be jettisoned before ditching. Survival kit attached to parachute harness. Contents emergency rations, water signal flares, shark repellent fishing line, first aid supplies. 3 hours in 62-degree water. It was possible. Difficult, but possible. Webb began descending to lower altitude where the air was warmer. He needed to preserve body heat before the ditching. Every degree of core temperature mattered for survival in cold water. At 10,000 feet, Webb's engine coughed. His fuel gauge showed 11 gallons. The engine smoothed out and continued running, but the warning was clear. Minutes remaining, not hours. Distance to Iwo Jima, 380 miles. Webb switched his fuel selector to the auxiliary tank, hoping to scavenge a few additional gallons from fuel lines and unused tank capacity. The engine ran smoothly for another 3 minutes. Then it coughed again, and again. The coughing became continuous. The propeller began to windmill as the engine lost power. Webb's hands moved through the ditching checklist. Canopy jettisoned. The metal and glass canopy flew away in the slipstream. Wind blasted into the cockpit. Shoulder harness locked. Seatbelt tight. Radio transmit position. Lifeguard 2, this is Dragon 7. Engine failure. Ditching now. Position approximately 370 miles north-northwest of Iwo Jima. Ditching now. Dragon 7, Lifeguard 2 copies. We have your position. Help is coming. Good luck. Webb established his glide at 110 miles per hour, the optimal speed for ditching a P-51. Too fast and the impact would kill him. Too slow and the aircraft would stall and spin into the ocean. The Pacific stretched endlessly below, blue water in every direction, no ships, no land, just ocean. Webb aimed for a smooth patch between wave sets. The goal was to touch down parallel to the waves, not into them. Landing perpendicular to the waves would cartwheel the aircraft and kill him instantly. Altitude 500 feet, airspeed 110 miles per hour. Webb pulled his oxygen mask aside so it would not trap water against his face. Altitude 100 feet. He could see individual waves now. The ocean was rougher than it appeared from altitude. 4-foot swells with whitecaps. Not ideal, but survivable. Altitude 50 feet. Webb pulled back gently on the stick flaring to reduce his descent rate. The Mustang's tail touched the water first. The impact was violent. The tail section dug into a wave and the nose pitched down hard. Webb's head slammed forward against the instrument panel. His vision went grey. Water exploded over the nose. The aircraft began sinking immediately. The heavy Packard Merlin engine in the nose acted as an anchor, pulling the Mustang down, tail high. Webb's training cut through the shock. Release seatbelt, now! He slapped the belt release. The belt fell away. He pushed himself up and out of the cockpit. His feet caught on something. The rudder pedals. He kicked free. The Mustang was vertical in the water, nose pointed straight down, sinking fast. Webb swam away from the aircraft as hard as he could. 3 strokes, 5 strokes, 10 strokes. He looked back. The tail of the Mustang was still visible, pointed at the sky like a tombstone. Then it slipped beneath the surface and was gone. Bubbles marked where it had been. Then even the bubbles stopped. Webb floated in the Pacific Ocean 370 miles from the nearest land. The water was shockingly cold. His flight suit was soaked. His life vest kept him afloat, but the cold was already leaching heat from his core. He pulled the signal flare from his survival kit and fired it into the sky. A brilliant red star shell arced upward and hung in the air for 30 seconds before falling into the ocean. If anyone was looking, they would see it. But the nearest rescue submarine was 90 miles south and submerged. The PBY Catalina rescue aircraft from Iwo Jima would not arrive for 3 hours. Webb was alone. He began the survival procedures. Inflate life vest fully. Check for injuries. His head was bleeding from the impact with the instrument panel, but the wound was not deep. Orient toward Iwo Jima, south-southeast. Begin swimming to maintain body heat. Kick feet. Move arms. Generate warmth through motion. The cold was insidious. It crept into his extremities first. His fingers went numb within 10 minutes. His feet lost feeling after 20 minutes. He could still move them, but he could not feel the movement. The ocean's swells lifted him up and dropped him down in an endless rhythm. Up and down, up and down. The horizon disappeared in the troughs and reappeared on the crests. The sky was blue. The water was blue. Everything was blue, except for the orange dye marker that leaked from his life vest, staining the water around him in a bright, fluorescent circle, visible from the air, if anyone was looking. Webb checked his watch. 30 minutes since ditching, 2.5 hours until rescue aircraft arrival. He could do this. He had to do this. His thoughts began to wander. The cold was affecting his brain. He thought about his girlfriend back in California. He had promised to marry her when the war ended. He thought about his mother, who had cried when he enlisted. He thought about Captain Grant and the rest of Dragon 8 flight still fighting over Tokyo, not knowing that Webb was floating in the ocean, dying by degrees. He thought about the mathematics, the fuel calculations that had seemed so precise on paper, the small decision to lean the mixture, the cascading consequences that ended with him in the water. Mathematics was supposed to be exact, predictable, reliable. But mathematics could not account for fouled spark plugs or panic-induced errors or the million small variables that affected real-world operations. Webb's watch showed 1 hour since ditching. His core temperature was dropping. He could feel it. The shivering had stopped, which was a bad sign. When the body stopped shivering, it meant hypothermia was entering the dangerous stage. His vision started to blur. He blinked hard, trying to clear it. The sky and ocean swirled together. He could not tell which way was up. He forced himself to focus, look at the horizon, orient to the waves. Keep breathing, keep moving, stay alive. At hour 2, Webb heard an engine, faint at first, then louder. He looked up and saw an aircraft, a PBY Catalina, the twin-engine amphibious patrol bomber that served as rescue aircraft throughout the Pacific. The PBY was early, a full hour ahead of schedule. Webb fired his last signal flare. The red star burst into the sky. The PBY turned toward him immediately. The aircraft circled once the pilot confirming Webb's position, then lined up for a water landing. The PBY touched down 200 yards from Webb's position. The engines throttled back to idle. A side hatch opened, and a crew member jumped into the water wearing a wetsuit. The crew member swam to Webb with powerful strokes, reached him within 2 minutes. "I got you, pilot. You're safe now. Let's get you aboard." Webb tried to respond, but his jaw would not work. The cold had paralyzed his muscles. The rescue swimmer secured a line around Webb's chest and signaled to the PBY. The crew winched Webb toward the aircraft, pulled him through the hatch, laid him on the deck. Someone wrapped him in blankets. Someone else started an IV. Hot water bottles were placed under his arms and between his legs. A corpsman was taking his vital signs and calling out numbers that sounded wrong. Core temp 91 degrees, pulse weak and thready, respirations shallow. He's going into severe hypothermia. We need to get him warm now. The PBY's engines roared to full power. The aircraft accelerated across the water, lifted off, climbed toward Iwo Jima. Webb's vision faded to black. The last thing he heard was the corpsman saying, "Stay with us, pilot. You made it. You're going home." Lieutenant Marcus Webb regained consciousness 18 hours later in the field hospital at Iwo Jima. Major Daniel Cross was sitting beside his bed. "Welcome back, Webb," Cross said quietly. "You gave us a scare." Webb's voice was a rasp. "How long was I in the water?" 2 hours and 6 minutes. The PBY diverted early when they heard your mayday. If they had stuck to the original schedule, you would have died." Webb absorbed that information. 2 hours and 6 minutes. He had beaten hypothermia by less than 1 hour. "My aircraft?" Webb asked. 16,000 feet of water. We're not getting it back." Webb closed his eyes. "I screwed up, sir. Leaned the mixture too much trying to fix a fouled plug. Put myself in fuel deficit I couldn't recover from." Cross was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was matter-of-fact. "You made a decision based on the information you had. The decision was reasonable. The outcome was bad luck. If that plug had stayed clean, you would have landed with fuel to spare. Sometimes the mathematics work against you, no matter how carefully you calculate. But No buts, Webb. You survived. That is all that matters, and you learned something that every pilot in this squadron needs to understand. The Pacific Ocean is the real enemy, not Japanese fighters. The ocean. It will kill you faster and more certainly than any zero. Respect it, fear it, and do everything in your power to avoid going into it." Webb nodded weakly. Cross stood. "Rest now. You're grounded for 2 weeks while you recover. When you come back, you'll fly again, and you'll be better for this experience." After Cross left, Webb stared at the tent ceiling and thought about the mission. The flight to Tokyo, the combat, the fuel crisis, the ditching, the cold, the rescue. He had flown 8 hours to reach Tokyo, fought for 6 minutes, and spent the next 3 hours trying not to die. The mathematics of the mission said it was possible. The reality had proven it was barely possible. And Major Cross expected them to do it 3 to 4 times per week. Webb closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but every time he started to drift off, he felt the cold water closing over him and jerked awake. The mathematics of impossibility had been rewritten by American engineers, but the ocean still kept its own brutal accounting, and the numbers always came due. June 1st, 1945, Iwo Jima, South Field, 0630 hours. The weather briefing officer pointed to a map of the Pacific between Iwo Jima and Japan. His voice carried the confidence of a man reading data from sophisticated meteorological instruments. "Gentlemen, forecast for today's mission to Osaka shows scattered clouds at 12,000 feet visibility, 10 miles winds from the west at 15 knots. Some build-ups possible over the target area, but nothing unmanageable. Overall conditions favorable for operations." Major Daniel Cross studied the weather map. 8 weeks had passed since the first Tokyo mission. The 7th Fighter Command had flown 23 long-range escort missions in those 8 weeks. The P-51 Mustangs had become routine visitors to Japanese skies. The mathematics of fuel and range that had seemed so impossible in April were now standard procedure. But Cross had learned to distrust weather forecasts. The Pacific was vast and unpredictable. Weather systems developed with terrifying speed. What looked manageable at briefing could become lethal 3 hours into a mission. "What's the confidence level on this forecast?" Cross asked. The weather officer hesitated. "Sir, our instruments show current conditions. Forecast is based on pressure trends and historical patterns. Confidence level 70%, which meant 30% chance the forecast was wrong." Cross thought about the 148 P-51 Mustangs that would launch in 90 minutes. He thought about the pilots who would spend 8 hours in cramped cockpits, flying over an ocean that killed without mercy. 30% chance of bad weather. Acceptable risk by military standards. Cross approved the mission. He would regret that decision for the rest of his life. At 0745 hours, 148 P-51 Mustangs lifted off from Iwo Jima's 3 airfields. The largest fighter mission yet attempted. The formation assembled over the volcanic island, then turned north-northwest toward Japan. Captain Robert Mitchell was not among them. Mitchell had died on Black Friday. But that was still hours away from happening. Lieutenant Marcus Webb was flying again. 2 weeks had passed since his ditching and rescue. The hypothermia had left him with nerve damage in his fingers and toes. He could still fly, but his hands ached constantly in the cold air at altitude. He did not mention this to the flight surgeon. He wanted to fly, needed to fly. The alternative was to sit on the ground and think about the cold water. Captain James Barrett led a flight of 4 Mustangs in the high cover position. Barrett had 9 confirmed victories now, 3 more kills and he would be an ace, but the number of victories mattered less than it had in April. The Japanese were sending up fewer fighters. The ones that did fly seemed almost reluctant to engage. Barrett understood why. The exchange ratio had been devastating. In 8 weeks of operations, American P-51s had destroyed 127 Japanese aircraft in aerial combat. American losses, 18 fighters shot down by enemy action, 7-1. The mathematics were unsustainable for the Japanese. At hour 1, the formation crossed the empty Pacific at 10,000 feet. The sky was clear. Visibility unlimited. The scattered clouds the weather officer had predicted were nowhere to be seen. At hour 2, the weather began to change. Barrett noticed it first, a dark line on the horizon ahead, storm clouds building from the surface to high altitude. The line stretched from east to west as far as he could see. He transmitted to Major Cross. "Dragon Leader Hawk, I'm seeing significant weather development ahead. Looks like a frontal system. Over." Cross responded. "Hawk, Dragon Leader copies." Weather officer said scattered clouds. "I'm seeing the same thing you are. That's more than scattered." The formation continued north. The dark line grew larger. At 370 miles from Iwo Jima, the true scale of the weather system became apparent. It was not a line, it was a wall. Thunderstorms extending from sea level to 24,000 feet or higher. The tops of the storm cells disappeared into the stratosphere. Lightning flickered inside the clouds. The wall stretched across the entire horizon. There was no way around it. To divert east or west would add hundreds of miles to the mission. They did not have the fuel for that. The only options were to penetrate the storm or abort the mission. Major Cross made the decision that commanders have made throughout military history when faced with incomplete information and impossible choices. He chose to press on. All Dragon flights, this is Dragon Leader. We're going through. Titan formation. Stay on instruments. We'll be in the clouds for 10 to 15 minutes maximum. Stay calm, stay on heading, we'll break out the other side. The formation entered the storm at 11:30 hours. The violence was immediate and absolute. Turbulence threw the Mustangs in every direction. Up, down, left, right. Barrett was slammed against his canopy with enough force to crack his helmet. His Mustang was ripped from 10,000 feet to 8,000 feet in 3 seconds, then thrown upward to 13,000 feet. The G-forces exceeded anything he had experienced in combat. Visibility 0. The clouds were so thick that Barrett could not see his own wingtips. He was flying on instruments in violent turbulence with 147 other aircraft somewhere in the same airspace. The risk of mid-air collision was catastrophic. Barrett fought his Mustang back to 10,000 feet and tried to maintain heading. The artificial horizon showed his aircraft inverted. He corrected. The turn indicator showed a steep right turn. He corrected. The instruments contradicted each other. Vertigo set in within seconds. Which way was up? Barrett forced himself to trust the instruments. The artificial horizon said wings level. The altimeter said 10,000 feet. The airspeed indicator said 220 miles per hour. He held heading 330 degrees. Lightning flashed so close that his radio filled with static. Thunder boomed loud enough to hear over the engine. Rain hammered the canopy with the sound of machine gun fire. And then Barrett heard the sound that every pilot dreaded. Metal tearing, an explosion muffled by distance and clouds. Someone had collided. The radio erupted with calls. Dragon 12 is spinning. I can't recover. Who's on fire? I see flames at my 3 o'clock. I'm inverted. Which way is up? Dragon 26. Pull up, pull. Static. Major Cross tried to restore order. All Dragon flights climb. Get above this weather. Climb to 25,000 feet. Now. Barrett pulled back on his stick and added power. His Mustang clawed upward through the storm. 12,000 feet, 15,000 feet, 18,000 feet. The turbulence was just as bad at altitude. The clouds were just as thick. At 22,000 feet, Barrett broke through the top of the storm. Clear air, blue sky, sunlight. He looked around for his wingmen. Gone. The formation had been torn apart. Barrett could see perhaps 20 other Mustangs scattered across the sky. Some were climbing through the cloud tops, others were circling, clearly disoriented. Barrett checked his fuel. The violent maneuvering in the storm had consumed fuel at combat power rates. His gauge showed 298 gallons remaining. He had been airborne for 3 hours. Normal consumption would have left him with 320 gallons. The storm had cost him an extra 22 gallons. Major Cross transmitted. All Dragon aircraft report by flight. Count off. The responses came back ragged and incomplete. Dragon 2 Flight 3 aircraft. Dragon 5 Flight 2 aircraft. Dragon 8 Flight 1 aircraft. That was Captain Grant's voice. 3 of his 4 aircraft were missing. Dragon 11 Flight no contact. Dragon 15 Flight 1 aircraft. Cross waited for more responses. Silence. He transmitted again. All missing Dragon aircraft, if you can hear this transmission, climb to 25,000 feet and home on Iwo Jima Beacon. Radio check every 15 minutes. Dragon leader out. Barrett did the mathematics in his head. The formation had entered the storm with 148 aircraft. Perhaps 100 had emerged above the storm. That meant 48 aircraft were still in the clouds. Some might break out, some might have turned back, some had collided, some had entered uncontrollable spins and crashed. The mission to Osaka was scrubbed. Major Cross ordered all aircraft to return to Iwo Jima immediately. The flight home was a nightmare of uncertainty. Every 15 minutes, pilots radioed their positions. Every 15 minutes, fewer pilots responded. At hour 5, the count was 121 aircraft. At hour 6, the count was 118 aircraft. At hour 7, the count was 115 aircraft. Barrett landed at Iwo Jima with fuel to spare. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely shut down the engine. He climbed out of his Mustang and stood on the volcanic ash, counting the returning aircraft. One by one, they landed. Each arrival was a small miracle. Each gap in the sequence represented a pilot who would not return. The final count came at 1800 hours, 8 hours after launch. 121 P-51 Mustangs had returned to Iwo Jima. 27 Mustangs were missing. 24 pilots were dead. 3 had been rescued by lifeguard submarines after ditching in the ocean between the storm and Iwo Jima. Not a single aircraft had been shot down by Japanese forces. Not one. The enemy had not fired a shot. The weather had destroyed 27 American fighters in less than 30 minutes. The 7th Fighter Command had suffered its worst single-day losses of the Pacific War, and the enemy responsible was a thunderstorm. Major Daniel Cross sat in his tent that night and wrote the casualty reports. 24 names, 24 young men who had survived training, survived the journey to Iwo Jima, survived previous combat missions only to die in a storm because a weather officer had said 70% confidence, and Cross had approved the mission. One of the names on the list was Captain Robert Mitchell, call sign Ghost, the pilot who had landed dead stick on the first Tokyo mission with 0 fuel remaining. Mitchell had survived that impossible feat only to die in a thunderstorm over the Pacific. Cross had written the words, "Lost in storm presumed dead," next to Mitchell's name. Mitchell's body would never be recovered. His aircraft was at the bottom of the Pacific in water so deep that sunlight never reached it. Cross thought about Mitchell's last transmission, the one that had come in broken and garbled through the static of the storm. "I'm in a spin. Can't recover. Altitude 3,000.
2,000. Tell my..." Then silence. Tell my what? Tell my mother? Tell my girlfriend? Tell my squadron? Cross would never know. The storm had taken Mitchell's last words, along with his life. The mathematics had been rewritten by American engineers. The fuel equation had been solved. The range problem had been defeated. Single-engine fighters could fly 750 miles to Tokyo and return, but the Pacific Ocean was 64 million square miles of water that killed without distinction, and weather systems developed that could destroy an entire formation of the world's most advanced fighters without firing a shot. Cross added a note to his mission report. Recommendation weather forecasts require higher confidence threshold for long-range missions. Minimum 85% confidence required to launch. Abort criteria must include significant weather development en route. The recommendation would be approved, but it came too late for the 24 pilots who died on June 1, 1945.
The day the P-51 pilots started calling Black Friday, July 1945, Tokyo. Lieutenant Kazuki Hayashi stood beside his Mitsubishi Zero and watched American fighters strafe his airfield from altitude so high he could barely see them. Silver contrails marked their passage across the sky. Then the fighters rolled over and dove. At 400 miles per hour, they screamed across the airfield at 50 feet altitude. Machine gun fire raked the line of parked Japanese aircraft. Zeros exploded, fuel tanks ruptured and burned. Mechanics scattered for cover. The American fighters pulled up, climbed back to altitude, and circled for another pass. Kazuki had fuel in his Zero. He had ammunition. He had orders, but the orders said, "Do not engage American fighters unless absolutely necessary. Preserve aircraft for decisive battle." The decisive battle. The American invasion of Japan that High Command promised was coming. When the invasion came, Japanese pilots would fly their aircraft into American ships. Kamikaze, divine wind. One pilot, one aircraft, one ship. The mathematics of desperation. So Kazuki stood beside his Zero and watched the Americans destroy his base while he did nothing. The psychological impact was devastating. He was a fighter pilot, ordered not to fight. He had 64 victories, 7 years of combat experience, and the skill to make the Americans pay for their arrogance. But his orders were clear. Preserve the aircraft. Do not engage. Around him, the Japanese Air Force was dying on the ground. The fuel situation had become catastrophic. Japan's oil refineries had been destroyed by American bombing. The tanker fleet had been sunk by American submarines. Synthetic fuel production was operating at 8% of required capacity. 8%. The numbers were brutal and specific. Japan needed 150,000 barrels of aviation fuel per month to sustain military operations. Actual production, 12,000 barrels per month. The deficit was insurmountable. Aircraft sat grounded for lack of fuel. Training flights were cancelled. Operational missions were minimized. The fuel that did exist was contaminated with impurities that damaged engines and reduced performance. Kazuki's squadron had started the war with 18 pilots. 12 had been killed in combat. The 6 survivors were training replacements. Boys, really. 17 and 18 years old with 40 to 70 hours of total flight time. Yesterday, Kazuki had tried to teach a 17-year-old named Hiroshi how to attack a bomber formation. The boy had never fired his guns at an aerial target, never practiced combat maneuvers, never seen an American fighter except in photographs. "Hayashi-san," the boy had asked, "how do I beat the Mustang?" Kazuki had looked at the boy's eager face and felt something break inside him. "You don't beat the Mustang," Kazuki had said quietly. "You avoid it. You survive. You run if you can." "But our duty is to fight." "No. Your duty is to live to see Japan rebuilt after we lose this war." The boy's face had shown shock. Japanese officers did not say such things. Defeat was unthinkable. The Emperor's divine will would ensure victory. But Kazuki had stopped believing in divine will on April the 7th when he watched 96 Mustangs circle over Tokyo with impunity. August 10th, 1945, 10:15 hours, Kazuki received the scramble order. American fighters approaching Tokyo. He ran to his Zero, climbed into the cockpit and went through the startup procedure with the efficiency of 7 years' practice. The Nakajima Sake engine coughed to life. The engine that once produced 1,130 horsepower now managed perhaps 900 horsepower on contaminated fuel. The Zero that once flew at 351 miles per hour now struggled to reach 310 miles per hour. The decline was measurable and irreversible. Kazuki's squadron put 8 aircraft in the air, 8 Zeros against what intelligence reported as 64 American P-51 Mustangs. The mathematics were absurd. 1-to-8 odds, obsolete fighters against the world's most advanced, contaminated fuel against high octane, exhausted veterans and terrified boys against superbly trained American pilots with hundreds of hours of experience. Kazuki knew how this would end, they all knew, but orders were orders. And some part of Kazuki wanted to fight one more time, wanted to prove that Japanese pilots still had courage even if they no longer had hope. At 25,000 feet over Tokyo, Kazuki spotted the American formation. Fewer than he expected, perhaps 15 fighters flying top cover over B-29 bombers. The rest of the American fighters must have been assigned to other sectors. 15 against 8, nearly even odds, almost fair. Kazuki selected a target, a Mustang flying slightly separated from its flight. The same tactic he had tried on April 7th. It had failed then. It would probably fail now, but Kazuki was out of new ideas. He pushed his stick forward and dove. His Zero accelerated to 340 miles per hour, the best his damaged engine could manage. The American pilot saw him coming and began a gentle turn. Kazuki fired at 450 yards, too far for optimal accuracy, but his Zero could not close the distance. The 20mm cannons roared. Tracers arced toward the target and missed. Again. The Mustang accelerated away at 420 miles per hour. Kazuki's Zero was at maximum speed and losing ground. The gap widened from 450 yards to 600 yards to 800 yards. Kazuki pulled out of his dive and climbed back toward altitude. His fuel gauge showed 31 minutes remaining. His ammunition 201 rounds of 20mm shells. He had fired at the most advanced fighter in the world with an obsolete aircraft using contaminated fuel and had accomplished nothing. The story of Japan's air war in a single engagement. Then Kazuki saw something that made his one remaining eye widen. One of the American Mustangs had separated from the formation and was diving toward a young Japanese pilot named Hiroshi, the boy Kazuki had tried to train, the boy who had asked how to beat a Mustang. The American pilot had a perfect setup. Altitude advantage, speed advantage, position advantage. Hiroshi never saw the threat. He was focused on trying to climb toward the B-29 bombers, following his training doing exactly what Kazuki had told him never to do. The Mustang closed from 1,000 yards to 400 yards in seconds. Kazuki watched the American pilot align his gun sight, watched the 6 machine guns fire, watched the tracers converge on Hiroshi's Zero. The Zero's wings separated from the fuselage. The aircraft entered an inverted spin. Hiroshi's canopy flew off. The boy tried to bail out, but the spin pinned him in the cockpit. The Zero fell toward Tokyo, spinning faster, and Hiroshi was still in it when it hit the ground. The American pilot climbed back to altitude and rejoined his formation. Kazuki felt rage and grief and helplessness in equal measure. Hiroshi had been 17 years old. He had never had a chance. Not against that aircraft, not against that pilot, not with 40 hours of training against an enemy with 500 hours. The mathematics were clear. Japanese pilot life expectancy was now measured in missions, 2.3 missions average. Hiroshi had survived 3 weeks. He had outlived the average by 7 days. Kazuki turned his Zero south and headed back to base. His wingmen followed. They had not shot down a single American aircraft. They had lost Hiroshi and 1 other pilot. The exchange ratio held at 7-1. At his airfield, Kazuki shut down his engine and sat in the cockpit. He was exhausted, not from the flight, but from the futility, from watching boys die in obsolete aircraft while he could do nothing to save them. A ground crew officer approached his Zero. "Hayashi-san, you have new orders. Report to operations immediately." Kazuki climbed out and walked to the operations tent. A staff officer he did not recognize was waiting with papers. "Lieutenant Hayashi, you have been selected for special training. Report to Kanoya Air Base tomorrow for kamikaze preparation. You will be assigned to the Kikusui Special Attack Corps. You will receive 1 week of training, then you will fly your aircraft into an American invasion fleet. Kamikaze. One-way mission. No return, no survival, just death and the hope that your sacrifice would sink an enemy ship." Kazuki took the orders with steady hands. "I understand. When does training begin?" "Tomorrow at 0800 hours. You are dismissed." Kazuki walked out of the operations tent and stood in the evening air. The sun was setting over Tokyo. Somewhere in the city, his wife Yuki and daughter Emiko were preparing dinner. He had not seen them in 2 months. Operational security prevented visits. He decided to violate operational security. He would see his family one more time before he flew away to die. 2. Kazuki reached his apartment in Shinjuku district at 2000 hours. The building had survived the bombing, though scorch marks on the walls showed how close it had come to destruction. He climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor and knocked on the door. Yuki opened it. Her face showed shock and joy and fear in rapid succession. "Kazuki, you're not supposed to be here. If your commanders find out—" "Let them find out," Kazuki said quietly. He stepped inside and closed the door. Emiko ran from the kitchen and threw herself at her father. "Papa, you came home." Kazuki picked up his daughter and held her tight. She was 8 years old now, growing tall. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn determination. "Hello, little flower," Kazuki whispered. "I missed you." After Emiko went to bed, Kazuki sat with Yuki in their small living room. She knew. She had always known when something was wrong. 7 years of marriage to a fighter pilot gave her instincts that words could not convey. "You're not coming back," she said. "Not a question, a statement." Kazuki nodded. "I have orders. Kamikaze. 1 week of training, then a mission against the American fleet." Yuki's hands shook. She folded them in her lap to steady them. "Is there no other way? The Emperor's will is absolute." "The Emperor is not here watching his daughter sleep. You are." Kazuki had no answer for that. The conflict between duty and family had no resolution. Japanese culture demanded absolute obedience to the Emperor. But Japanese culture also revered family and the duty of a father to protect his children. "If I refuse," Kazuki said slowly, "they will execute me for cowardice. You and Emiko will be shamed. The government may revoke your ration cards. You could starve. And if you fly your mission, Emiko grows up without a father. I grow old without a husband. How is that better?" Kazuki reached for his wife's hand. Her fingers were cold. "I have no good answer. I only know that I must do my duty." They sat in silence for a long time, outside the sounds of Tokyo at night, distant sirens, the rumble of trucks moving supplies, the normal sounds of a city at war. Finally, Yuki spoke. "When the war ends, and it will end, Kazuki, everyone knows it will end. What should I tell Emiko about her father? Tell her I did my duty. She won't understand duty. She's 8 years old. She'll only understand that her father is gone. Kazuki closed his eye. The empty socket where his right eye had been ached. It always ached when he was tired or stressed. The wound was 10 years old, but it never fully healed. "Tell her I loved her," he said finally. "Tell her I wanted to watch her grow up. Tell her I'm sorry." Yuki nodded. Tears ran down her face, but she made no sound. August 14th, 1945, 0630 hours, Kanoya Air Base. Kazuki stood beside his Mitsubishi Zero in the pre-dawn darkness. The aircraft had been modified for the kamikaze mission. A 250-kilogram bomb was mounted beneath the fuselage. The bomb would detonate on impact with an American ship. The explosion would kill Kazuki instantly and hopefully sink the target. The mathematics of kamikaze were simple and brutal. One pilot plus one aircraft plus one bomb equaled one dead American ship. If the pilot was skilled and brave and lucky. Most kamikaze pilots were not skilled. They were boys with minimal training flying obsolete aircraft against the most sophisticated air defense systems in the world. The success rate was approximately 11%. 89% of kamikaze pilots died without hitting anything, but 11% was better than 0%, and Japan had more pilots than it had fuel or modern aircraft. The kamikaze represented the mathematics of desperation. Kazuki climbed into his Zero and began the startup procedure for what he expected to be the last time. His hands moved across the instruments with practiced efficiency. Master switch on, fuel selector to main tank, mixture rich, propeller full forward, throttle cracked 1 inch, magnetos both, primer 3 strokes, engage starter. The Nakajima engine coughed, caught and settled into its familiar rough idle. Kazuki let it warm up for 2 minutes, then began taxiing toward the runway. The radio crackled. "All aircraft hold position. Do not take off. Stand by for important announcement." Kazuki stopped his Zero on the taxiway and waited. Around him, other kamikaze pilots did the same. 23 aircraft loaded with bombs and fuel and young men who expected to die today. The radio transmission changed, a voice Kazuki had never heard on a military frequency. High-pitched, formal, speaking in classical Japanese that was difficult to understand. The Emperor's voice. The Emperor was speaking directly to his people. Unprecedented, impossible. But it was happening. The speech lasted several minutes. The classical Japanese was archaic and formal, but the meaning gradually became clear. Japan had accepted the Potsdam Declaration. Japan was surrendering. The war was over. Kazuki sat in his cockpit, listening to the words that meant Japan had lost, and he would not have to die today. The emotions were overwhelming and contradictory. Relief, grief, shame, gratitude, confusion. The war was over. 7 years of fighting, 7 years of killing and surviving and watching friends die. 7 years that ended with a radio announcement from an emperor whose voice he had never heard before. Kazuki shut down his engine and climbed out of the Zero. The bomb beneath the fuselage would never be dropped. The aircraft would never fly another combat mission. He would never kill another enemy pilot. He would go home to Yuki and Amiko and try to build a life in a defeated nation. Kazuki collapsed to his knees beside his Zero. Other pilots were doing the same. Some were crying, some were shouting in anger, some were silent with shock. Kazuki pressed his forehead to the volcanic ash and wept. Relief and grief and shame and gratitude all at once. He had survived. His family had survived. Japan had survived, though at a cost that would take generations to fully comprehend. The war was over, and Kazuki Hayashi, who had flown his first combat mission in China in 1938 and his last combat mission over Tokyo in August 1945, would never fly in combat again. September 1945, Tokyo. American occupation forces arrived in Japan with overwhelming strength and unexpected mercy. The soldiers who had fought so brutally across the Pacific showed restraint and discipline in victory. Food aid flowed into Japan's starving cities. Medical supplies arrived. The occupation was professional and organized. Kazuki, who had expected vengeance, found instead a conquering army that seemed more interested in reconstruction than retribution. He took a job as a translator for the occupation forces. His English learned during his pre-war training was good enough for basic communication. The job paid in food rations that kept Yuki and Amiko from starving. One day in October, Kazuki was assigned to translate for an American air unit conducting demonstration flights at a former Japanese airfield. He arrived at the field and saw P-51 Mustangs parked on the flight line, the same silver fighters that had shattered Japanese air defenses. An American pilot approached, captain's rank, mid-20s. When the pilot removed his flight helmet, Kazuki recognized him. The Mustang pilot from August 10th. The one who had shot down Hiroshi, the one Kazuki had tried unsuccessfully to engage. The American pilot recognized Kazuki at the same moment. The recognition was mutual and instant. Combat creates bonds that transcend language and nationality. The American extended his hand. Captain James Barrett, 78th Fighter Squadron. I remember you, April 7th. You were flying a Zero with combat damage to the canopy. Kazuki shook the offered hand. Lieutenant Kazuki Hayashi, 301st Fighter Squadron. Yes, you shot out my canopy. Good shooting. Barrett looked uncomfortable. August 10th. I shot down a young pilot, Zero with red markings on the tail. Was he one of yours? Kazuki's face hardened. Hiroshi, 17 years old, 40 hours of flight time. He never had a chance against you. I'm sorry. War is not about being sorry. You did your duty. He died doing his. This is the nature of combat. They stood in awkward silence for a moment. Then Barrett spoke again. Your Zero, it was a beautiful aircraft. You flew it well. If circumstances had been different, we would not have fought, Kazuki finished. But they were what they were. Your Mustang was the superior aircraft. America was the superior industrial power. The outcome was determined by mathematics, not courage. Barrett nodded slowly. I studied your tactics after the war. The Zero's maneuverability was extraordinary. In a turning fight at low speed, you had every advantage. But you never gave us that fight. You used speed and energy tactics we had no counter for. This is why you won. Not just tactics, Barrett said quietly. We had better aircraft because we had better factories, better fuel because we had more oil, better pilots because we had more time and resources for training. The war was won in factories and oil fields as much as in the sky. Kazuki appreciated the honesty. Most victors did not acknowledge the role of industrial capacity. They preferred to credit courage or tactics or divine favor. What did you fight for? Kazuki asked suddenly. Barrett thought about the question. I fought to protect my family, my country, to stop Japan from expanding across the Pacific. What did you fight for? The same, to protect my family, my country, to preserve Japan from American invasion. Kazuki smiled without humor. We fought each other for the same reason. Funny how war works. Not funny. Tragic. They walked together across the airfield. The P-51 Mustangs sat on the flight line, still magnificent even in peace. The Zeros were gone scrapped or shipped to America as war trophies. Barrett stopped beside his Mustang. Would you like to see the cockpit? Kazuki hesitated, then nodded. Barrett climbed up on the wing and gestured for Kazuki to follow. Inside the cockpit, Kazuki examined the instruments with professional interest. The layout was efficient. The bubble canopy provided extraordinary visibility. The 6.50 caliber machine gun triggers sat beneath the control stick grip, ready to unleash devastating firepower. Packard Merlin 16507, Barrett said. 1,695 horsepower, 437 miles per hour top speed, range with drop tanks 1,650 miles. It was the finest fighter of the war. Kazuki nodded. Yes. We knew this after April 7th. Your appearance over Tokyo told us the war was lost. We just did not accept it for 4 more months. If you had accepted it in April, thousands of lives would have been saved, Japanese and American. Governments do not surrender based on rational mathematics. They surrender when hope dies. Our hope did not die until the atomic bombs fell. Barrett had no response to that. The atomic weapons were still too new, too terrible, too unprecedented to discuss casually. Kazuki climbed down from the Mustang's wing. Thank you for showing me. It is a privilege to see the aircraft that defeated us. There is no shame in losing to superior engineering. There is honor in how you fought, Barrett said. Your pilots were brave, skilled. They fought against impossible odds and they never quit. Bravery cannot overcome 86 miles per hour speed differential. This is the lesson we learned. They shook hands again, 2 pilots who had tried to kill each other and failed, now standing together in a defeated nation trying to find meaning in the violence they had survived. November 1946. Kazuki took Emiko to a museum in Tokyo that displayed Japanese military equipment from the war. A Mitsubishi Zero was suspended from the ceiling, preserved as a memorial to the pilots who had flown them. Emiko, now 9 years old, looked up at the aircraft with curiosity. "Papa, is this what you flew?" "Yes, little flower. I flew Zeros for 7 years." "Was it a good airplane?" Kazuki considered the question carefully. It was a beautiful airplane, fast and maneuverable. In 1941, it was the finest fighter in the Pacific. But by 1945, it was obsolete. The Americans built better fighters. Their P-51 Mustang was superior in every way, except low-speed maneuverability. "Did you ever fight a Mustang?" "Many times. I never shot one down. They were too fast, too powerful, too well built." Emiko processed this information with the logic of a 9-year-old. So the Americans won because they had better airplanes. The Americans won because they had better factories to build better airplanes, better oil fields to fuel them, better schools to train pilots, and better systems to maintain them. War between industrial powers is won by the side with greater production capacity. Courage and skill matter, but mathematics matters more. "That doesn't seem fair," Kazuki smiled sadly. "War is not fair, little flower. War is mathematics." Japan challenged the world's greatest industrial power and learned a very expensive lesson. Sometimes the bravest thing is to admit you cannot win and surrender before more people die. They stood together, looking at the Zero, the aircraft that had ruled Pacific skies for 18 months and then became a death trap for the pilots who flew it against superior opposition. "What should I remember about the war, Papa?" Kazuki put his hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Remember that war is terrible and should be avoided. Remember that industrial capacity matters more than warrior spirit. Remember that even enemies can respect each other. And remember that defeat is not the end. Japan will rebuild. We will learn from this. We will become stronger through wisdom rather than conquest." Emiko nodded seriously. "I will remember, Papa." 1984. International Air Show, Tokyo. Kazuki Hayashi, 73 years old, stood beside the flight line, watching a restored P-51 Mustang and a restored Zero perform a demonstration flight. The two aircraft flew in formation, their former enmity transformed into aerial ballet. Beside Kazuki stood James Barrett, also 73, retired airline pilot, 9 World War II victories, Distinguished Flying Cross recipient. The two old pilots had maintained contact over the decades, occasional letters, meetings at air shows, a friendship built on mutual respect and shared experience. A young reporter approached them with a camera crew. "Excuse me, sirs, can I ask you both a question?" Kazuki and Barrett nodded. "You both flew in the war. You fought against each other. Who had the better aircraft?" Kazuki and Barrett looked at each other and smiled. They answered simultaneously. "They did." Both pointed at each other. The reporter looked confused. "But someone must have had the better aircraft. The Americans won." Barrett spoke first. "The Zero was a marvel for its time. Lightweight, maneuverable, long-ranged. In 1941, it was unstoppable." Kazuki continued. "But the Mustang was the future. Powerful engine, superior speed, robust construction, incredible range, the finest fighter aircraft of World War II. So the Mustang was better." "In 1945, yes," Kazuki said. "But that is not the point. The point is that both aircraft represented the peak of their nation's capabilities at different times. The Zero represented Japanese engineering at its finest in 1940. The Mustang represented American engineering at its finest in 1944. The 4-year gap in development time made all the difference." The reporter persisted. "Who won the air war?" "America won," Kazuki said without hesitation. "Decisively, completely. But not because American pilots were braver or more skilled. Because American factories could produce 15,586 Mustangs, while Japan produced 10,939 Zeros. Because American training schools had unlimited fuel, while Japanese schools rationed every gallon. Because American maintenance had proper tools and parts, while Japanese maintenance improvised with scraps. Industrial capacity decided the war." Barrett added, "And in losing Japan learned something valuable. Defeat is not permanent. Japan rebuilt and became an economic power. Sometimes losing a war teaches lessons that winning cannot." The reporter asked one final question. "What do you want people to remember about your experiences?" Kazuki thought about April 7th, 1945, the day he watched 96 Mustangs circle over Tokyo and realized everything he believed was wrong. The day hope died and reality took its place. Remember that mathematics matters more than courage. Remember that industrial wars are won in factories, not cockpits. Remember that even enemies can become friends. And remember that the men who flew and fought deserve respect regardless of which side they served. Barrett nodded agreement. We were both doing our duty. We both fought for our families and our countries. The fact that we fought each other does not diminish the honor in that. War is tragic, but the warriors on both sides can still respect each other's service. The P-51 and Zero flew overhead in formation, their engines creating a symphony of history. The Packard Merlin's deep roar and the Nakajima Sakai's higher-pitched note blended together. Kazuki watched the aircraft and thought about all the pilots who never lived to see this moment. Captain Mitchell, who died in a storm. Hiroshi shot down at 17. The 24 American pilots lost on Black Friday, the hundreds of Japanese pilots killed in unequal combat against superior opposition. They had all done their duty, they had all fought with courage, and they had all been subject to mathematics that cared nothing for bravery. The industrial capacity of nations determined the outcome. The 86-mile-per-hour speed differential decided individual combats. The fuel calculations enabled or prevented missions. The production numbers predicted victory and defeat. Mathematics was the ultimate arbiter, and the P-51 Mustang flying 750 miles from Iwo Jima to Tokyo and back had been the perfect expression of mathematical superiority. The aircraft that did the impossible and proved that nothing is impossible when engineering excellence meets unlimited industrial capacity. Epilogue. The P-51 Mustang served in air forces worldwide until the 1980s. It fought in the Korean War. It served in counterinsurgency roles for decades. Of 15,586 Mustangs, built over 200 remain airworthy today. The Mitsubishi Zero flew its last combat mission on August 15, 1945. Of 10,939 Zeros built, fewer than 10 remain airworthy today. Kazuki Hayashi died in 1998 at age 82. He had 2 grandchildren living in California, the nation he once fought against. James Barrett died in 2003 at age 79. He flew commercially for 30 years after the war, logging over 25,000 hours without incident. Daniel Cross retired as a lieutenant colonel in 1963. He died in 1987 at age 68. He never forgave himself for the Black Friday mission. Marcus Webb survived hypothermia and flew 23 more missions. He died in 2008 at age 87, surrounded by family. The final accounting of the very long-range campaign, April through August 1945, 51 major missions flown. 206 Japanese aircraft destroyed in air combat. 180 P-51’s lost total. Fewer than 30 lost to enemy action. More than 150 lost to weather mechanical failure and fuel exhaustion. Exchange ratio in air combat, 7-1. B-29 mission success rate with escort, 95%. The mathematics spoke for themselves. In modern warfare between industrial powers, production capacity determines victory. Courage matters, skill matters, but mathematics matters more. The P-51 Mustang proved that truth over the skies of Japan in 1945, and the 750-mile impossibility became routine because American engineers refused to accept that anything was truly impossible.